Hey all, I'm Kel Kidman. Welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we begin with Ellen, or now Elliot Page, saying that she is a transgender man. Now, as you could tell probably from just that first sentence, you know where my opinion stands, and also through the thumbnail and title of this video. And I'm going to go into this. Essentially, the story isn't particularly important, it's just really an excuse for me to talk about this issue. But to start off with, and the premise that I'm going to be going on for this entire argument that I'm going to be making here, gender ideologues and people with gender dysphoria are two different groups of people. That is the premise I begin with. And the reason I begin with that premise is because it is important to distinguish between those two groups, as I've hopefully made it clear, at least thus far. But what might not be clear at this juncture is why I believe that. And the reason I believe that is, though people with gender dysphoria and gender ideologues come to similar conclusions, they run on fundamentally different logic. And the whole transgender issue thing is an enigmatic issue anyway, because there are so many different types of logic that you use to get to the same fundamental conclusion that it is very difficult to parse. And within the gender ideologues, you have multiple contradictory, might I add, definitions of the term gender and different logics, whether someone believes that sex does exist or it doesn't. You know, all these sorts of things where they're all contradictory of each other, but they all exist within the same group. But those are all within the same group. They're just inconsistencies within that group. What I am trying to make the distinction here today is the distinction between the group of people who have a mental disorder, some people who legitimately believe not just that they have a different gender than their sex, but people who believe that their sex is wrong. Now, what you might notice is that the idea that one's sex is wrong and the idea that someone has a different gender than their sex are similar ideas and lead to similar outcomes and conclusions, or at least they would seem to at the outset, because the difference between them is quite minute. It's somewhat subtle, but it leads to large differences in how the psychology of it ends up working. And in conflating these two groups, which most people do a lot of the time, you end up hurting the people with gender dysphoria the most. The reason being is that you're treating the people with gender dysphoria and the people who are gender ideologues at the same time as the same group of people, and using the same treatments for both. Because people who are gender ideologues do not have a mental disorder, all right? They are people who ideologically disagree with things like biological sex or gender roles or that sort of thing. They're people who are ideologically left and fall to that ideology and all of their strictures. And that includes things like believing in many, many genders or whatever, what have you, and all these sorts of definitional arguments. People who have gender dysphoria, people who actually believe that they are the wrong sex, they're a very different group of people. They don't fall under the same strictures. And what ends up happening is that the people who have gender dysphoria are the ones with the high suicide rate. They're the ones who have all of these, who are prone to depression and prone to all of these sorts of negative things all over the place. Whereas people who are gender ideologues might just be trust fund kids, or people who just don't like their parents and think they are rebelling, or what have you. It's a very different phenomenon. And I get really angry when people try to conflate these two groups. Because, as I've already explained, they're very different, and they aren't the same group. They don't work well together, even. They might seem to on the outset, as they lead to similar conclusions, but their fundamental logic doesn't work together. A gender ideologue makes a lot of definitional arguments, and to go on to this, I'm going to, rather than just attack some sort of empty chair next to me, I need some sort of solid thing to attack. We could talk about the definition of gender. And this is where I'm going to go into and explain what gender ideologues are, as opposed to people who have gender dysphoria. Gender ideologues are people who would take the Merriam-Webster definition of gender, which I'm using currently, or one of the gender ideologue definition of gender, and that is gender identity, which, by the way, completely nonsensical definition. It's just a tautological definition, which means it's redundant, by the way. using the word that you're trying to define in the definition means the definition is worthless. And those are the people who would struggle to even define the terms they're using, but they are, the gender ideologues are those who are all up on the identity stuff. They're all up on the, oh, you can just choose all of these things, and it's all about the gender roles and the wearing of the dresses and whatnot. Whereas the people who have gender dysphoria are more about the physiological part of it. They're about the sex change surgery. They're about all the hormonal stuff. And there isn't a hard and fast line for this. To be clear, I'm not a medical doctor and couldn't properly diagnose this, though I could separate it fairly well. It's not a hard and fast line. There are people who straddle it, and a lot of the sort of child transgenders certainly do, mostly because the child themselves, the children themselves generally do have gender dysphoria or some version of it, and the parents are the gender ideologues in that case. So it's not a hard and fast line, but it's still important to distinguish between those two. Because when you're trying to treat people who are talking about these definitional arguments and are saying things like gender is a social construct, or that people can just identify however they wish, and are talking about moon gender and all this sort of out there nonsense, those people are not going to be treated the exact same way, and they don't have the same solutions to their problems as the person who says, I don't like what my body is. Or the people who look down at their genitalia or their sexual organs and say, that is wrong, and I need to get rid of that. Those people are more similar to people who have similar body dysmorphias. Things like people who believe they should be blind. People who believe they shouldn't have one of their arms. These things exist, and they're much more similar to gender dysphoria than they are to gender ideologues. They're different, okay? And that's really what I want to get across. These groups are different. Do not conflate them. And this is important not just for those on the gender ideologue side, but especially for conservatives, for people like me who are not pro all of this stuff. Because if we mess it up, if we don't understand what is going on that side very specifically, then what ends up happening is that we end up causing a lot of problems ourselves. We end up falling for their ideological trick, their definitional trick. And we end up conflating groups that we really shouldn't be. Because the most prime example of this I've seen from the conservative side is people calling all people, gender ideologues, mentally disabled, or having mental illness. Seeing people say that to even people like now Elliot Page likely doesn't have gender dysphoria. Likely it's just a way to signal virtue for her ideological purity. That's likely what it is. It's likely not that she believes that her genitalia are somehow wrong. And by the way, for those who complain about the pronoun stuff, I use sex-based pronouns. I have taken a active stance against using the word gender as a general rule. I don't use it. I make an active point of not using it. Reason being is that it's just not a useful term. It just isn't. I mean, you can't define it clearly. Whenever you try to define it, it's generally a tautological definition, which means it has no definition. Functionally, you're not explaining anything to me, and and my belief of what language is that it's the process of making something from my mind go into your mind. And so if I'm not saying something useful, if I'm not giving you, if my words aren't defined in ways that are useful, I shouldn't use them. That's my opinion on that. But I think we've gotten a bit off into the weeds there, because this is a topic I've always wanted to talk about. It's just something that's been boiling up inside me, because it's always annoyed me that these two groups of people have been conflated, because it's very dangerous to those with a mental disorder when you're conflating them with a group that's ideological in nature, because mental disorders are not ideological, or at least not broadly. They don't have an ideology generally, and to treat them as the same as some ideological group is most of the time silly, because even though people who do have mental disorders can join ideological groups for reasons that have to do with their mental disorder, the mental disorder itself has nothing to do with the ideology. It's something that exists outside of it. And to conflate them is extremely dangerous for the person who has a mental disorder and for the ideology itself, frankly. It's just... And this sort of thing has annoyed me for a very long time, particularly on the conservative side, because we've never gotten this clear. We've never truly explicated exactly what our beliefs are, though we have somewhat explained and pontificated on that difference between people who have gender dysphoria and people who don't. It has never been extremely clear, and I really, really want to change that. And, I think that's where I'm going to leave you with that story, just because I think it's better suited to a more in-depth video where I'm scripting it all out rather than this sort of off-the-cuff thing that I do with Breaking on the Daily. And that might come eventually. I have tried to write that sort of script over and over again, and it's difficult because it's a complicated issue. It truly is. It really is a complicated issue. And I want to get everything right. And so I've been very perfectionist on that. But I am trying to get that out there. And I hope it will come out eventually. And hopefully soon, actually. But that's where I'm going to leave you with that story. To move on to more election updates. Wisconsin USPS subcontractor alleges backdating of tens of thousands of mail-in ballots. I just want to remind you all, as we continue on through the election, I'm not stopping covering it. It's just that a lot of what's going on right now is not final. I don't like talking about these sorts of mostly non-permanent things, all these things which change within hours of them being posted. And, all of these allegations, all of these sworn affidavits are, of course, important. I'm not denying that. Obviously, this is an important thing. This should be filed in court. This should be looked into. All of these things should be investigated. But the problem is that we're kind of in the middle of the investigation right now. And until we get a Supreme Court decision, which should be coming down the pike pretty soon here, nothing's really permanent. We don't really know where anything's going right now. It's all up in the air. And so I don't think looking at it, or at least looking at it with any sort of, large, kind of pinpoint focus is extremely useful right now. At least not for me. I mean, there is more stories with things like whistleblowers saying the post service labeled Trump mail as undeliverable with 388,000 ballots backdated and disappear. It's just ridiculous. I mean, the Voter Integrity Project and their data is being looked into by the FBI. I mean, a lot of these things are happening currently. And yeah, you had the whole Barr thing from yesterday, but that was taken out of context, as other people have rightfully explained. It's an example of the media just taking what he said and kind of misconstruing it, because what he said was, oh yeah, we don't have anything of that nature yet, essentially, because the investigation is still going on, so obviously it's not over. So even if they haven't found anything yet, it doesn't mean it won't happen. It's silly, and Barr, of course, should be criticized for saying something like that during an investigation, because obviously you're not going to have all the evidence before the investigation finishes. It's just a mess. Like, all of this stuff changes so quickly, and it's really not even really worth covering in large respect. But on to our next story, and this is just a dumb one. It's been in the news for like a week, but I hate it. See, for those who don't know, I live in Utah, and I hate this story. It is about the whole Utah Monolith thing. A photographer said he watched the now famous monolith in Utah fall to the ground. There's nothing mysterious about this monolith story. I mean, there's all this innuendo in a lot of the mainstream media coverage where it's like, ooh, was it put there by aliens? Look, it's riveted together aluminum. Wow, who could have guessed that? It's just, dude, there is nothing mysterious about this story. Nothing. I mean, does it deserve to be a local story? Yeah, sure. An international story for a week with a copycat in Romania? No. This is not deserved. It's just the dumbest story I could possibly imagine. Because what you're looking at is you're literally looking at stamped together sheet metal. That's it. Anyone with a router could just do that. Like, anyone with access to a router and a bunch of free time could just do that at any time. it's just riveted together aluminum. Who cares? And it's just, man, and I like, the picture looked nice. I probably would have liked to go and see it as like a tourist attraction, but does it deserve to be international news? No. Especially when you're implying, oh, was it put there by aliens? No, it wasn't. There's nothing mysterious about this. This isn't even a thing of Occam's razor, because Occam's razor still assumes that there's something that we don't know. In this case, we know everything. It's just riveted together freaking sheet metal. That's it. We knew that from pretty much the beginning. It's such a dumb story. I hate it. It's just the worst. Yeah, to get into more serious news. The Brits now have a COVID vaccine. I still can't pronounce that company's name, the one that starts with a P. I still can't pronounce it, and I'm not gonna try. I hate to break it to you, it isn't gonna happen. I can't remember it. I've been told how to pronounce it. Cannot remember how it was actually pronounced. But yeah, I mean, just if you needed any more evidence that a government bureaucracy like the FDA is completely worthless and mostly just wastes our time, yeah, yeah. I mean, this isn't a story that I exactly was surprised about. I mean, really, the FDA should have already confirmed this probably a week ago. I mean, it should really only require them to look into how Pfizer, it looks like how Pfizer did their study. Like, it should really only require that. I mean, why is this taking so long? I mean, we should have it by the end of the week, I guess. Or not have it, but have it approved by the end of the week. But why isn't it approved now? I mean, I get we're like kind of on the other one. Like, it seems to be more the focus in America. But just, I don't know. This just seems silly. It's just a silly story of government bureaucracy messing things up, which shouldn't be uncommon to most of you. But man, on to our last story, and this is a doozy from Joe Biden. Joe Biden. U.S. Constitution clearly requires illegal aliens be included in congressional appointments. Oh, that's such a stupid thing to say, because that's obviously not true. It's obviously not true. It clearly requires, but he couldn't frickin'... Oh, man. Here's his quote. Today, the Supreme Court of the United States has heard a case about whether everyone in America will be counted in the census for the purpose of appointment of congressional seats, and as the Constitution plainly and clearly requires. Of course, he doesn't quote anything there. But back to the quote. Or whether partisans in politics of intimidation and xenophobia will intentionally exclude specific groups of people from being counted. It's a case about whether we deny our ability to govern responsibly and undermine our fidelity to our laws and values of government of, by, and for all people. Dude, as I've already explained, illegal immigrants can't vote. They can't vote. They're not citizens. I mean, they can vote in some local elections in, like, California crazy places, and I'm sure they get counted for those, but it doesn't make sense to count them on the U.S. Census when they can't vote in any federal elections. This doesn't make any sense. No. Obviously, that's not true. And of course, he doesn't quote the Constitution. He doesn't say where in the Constitution it says clearly that everyone in America should be counted. No, he just says it. Because it isn't in the Constitution. It doesn't even... that's the funny thing. The Constitution doesn't even really stipulate how any person should be counted on the census. I mean, it technically says, yeah, all American households. And I think it talks about, I mean, you have the 3/5 clause, maybe that applies, because there are certain non-citizens that need to be counted. But, come on. No. I mean, if any part of the Constitution is outdated, it is the 3/5 compromise, and that should probably be removed anyway. Like, I'm surprised that wasn't amended out of the Constitution, but it's just there. I mean, it's not important, obviously, but I don't see the problem with amending that out of the Constitution and just making it clear that it should be counted based on, like, the citizenry. You know, the people who can actually vote and people who are actually being governed by the Constitution, and the people who are supposed to govern through the Constitution. Obviously, it should only be them. Obviously, they're the ones voting. I don't know. That's such a stupid statement, and he doesn't quote it. He doesn't quote anything. Like, if it was that clear, he would quote it. It's such a silly thing. And, that's the end of our stories for today. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm Kel Kidman, and I'm out.